Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tiggs, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here on Treaty 1 territory. That's the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are so delighted that you could join us both here in person and virtually, to all those watching on YouTube, for the launch of quite an important book, The Sweetest Dance on Earth, New and Selected Poems by Brandt. This is a book that celebrates, in the words of the publisher, the diverse poetics of this celebrated prairie writer, Brandt, the inaugural poet laureate here in Winnipeg, and somebody whose collections have graced poetry shelves around the city and around the world for many years. So it's particularly thrilling to not only see this career rate partially encapsulated in the book, no book could entirely do justice to it, but it is lovely to have poems from so many wonderful eras of Dai's development within two covers. But I will not speak too extemporaneously. Instead, I will go to the procedure for this evening. First of all, thanking Turnstone Press for publishing this book, ensuring we have copies of this book, and of course, for helping to organize this event as well. Now, there will be a reading from this podium from Dai after she is introduced by Sarah Ens. Following that, we'll move along to a conversation which will take place on these chairs just to my left. There will then be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. If you're physically here in the space, please just put up your hand and I'll run over with a microphone. This just ensures that even if you have a loud voice here, this ensures that those watching on YouTube can also hear you as well, as that amplification is required. And if you are one of those folks watching on YouTube, please just feel free to write your questions in the chat and we will put them to Dai as time permits. I will have some instructions regarding the signing procedure for you at the close of the event, but I shan't bore you with those now. Instead, I know you're all very keen to get to the main event. So first, I'll just introduce tonight's host for the evening. Sarah Ens is a writer and editor based in Treaty 1 territory, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Her poetry and nonfiction have appeared in numerous publications throughout North America. Her debut collection, The World is Mostly Sky, was shortlisted for the 2021 McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award and the 2022 Lansdowne Prize for Poetry. Sarah holds a BFA in Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia and an MFA in Writing from the University of Saskatchewan. Flyway is her second book of poetry and was published and launched in May of this year here in this space. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Sarah Ens.
Thank you. It is my very great pleasure and privilege to introduce Brandt and her wonderful new book, The Sweetest Dance on Earth, this evening. Dai's poetry has been shaping my work and my life since I was a teenager, hiding out in my basement bedroom in Landmark, Manitoba, consumed with big feelings and big questions and not at all sure what to do about them. Luckily, when I was 16, my dad gave me a guidepost in the form of Brandt's debut collection, Questions I Asked My Mother, winner of the Gerald Lampert Memorial Award and nominee for the Governor General's Award for Poetry. For me and for many, many readers around the world, this book was a revelation. It was the first book of poetry I loved, and it was the book of poetry that in many ways empowered the next generation of Mennonite poets like myself to write honestly, courageously, playfully, and imaginatively about our biggest questions. After publishing Questions I Asked My Mother in 1987, Brandt continued to pave the way with her poetry, experimenting with form and genre and exploring many diverse subjects like prairie, urban, and global landscapes, grandmotherhood, the environmental crisis, and spirituality. She has published more than a dozen books of poetry, fiction, creative essays, and literary criticism. Winnipeg's inaugural poet laureate, she has received numerous prestigious awards, including the Gold and Silver National Magazine Awards for Poetry, the CAA National Poetry Prize, the Gabrielle Roy Prize for Best Book of Literary Criticism in Canada, and the aforementioned Gerald Lampert Award for the Best First Book of Poetry in Canada. She has been nominated for the Governor General's Award for Poetry twice, the Pat Lowther Award for Best Book of Poetry by a Woman in Canada 3 times, the Griffin Poetry Prize, and the Dillon's Commonwealth Poetry Prize, among many others. She has collaborated with artists across disciplines, media, languages, cultures, and generations, including Aganitha Dick, Diana Thornycroft, and Kenneth Nichols. She currently lives in Winnipeg and teaches Canadian literature and creative writing at the University of Winnipeg. This year, she is also serving as the virtual writer-in-residence at the University of New Brunswick. The Sweetest Dance on Earth showcases the breadth and diversity of Di's extraordinary work, both brand new and spanning her previous publications. I had the opportunity to talk with Di about her poetry over the years, her trajectory as a writer, and her goals and hopes for this collection as the editor on this project. And the result truly is a celebration of one of Canada's finest poets. Please give a warm welcome to Di Brandt.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. And thank you to McNally Robinson Booksellers and especially Turnstone Press for the heroic good work of continuing to put out beautiful books for writers in Canada in a time when it's not easy to do that, not easy to keep the ship going. So I feel very privileged and honored to be on the list. And thank you, Sarah, for the very lovely editing companionship as we were putting this book together. I'm not sure if Sarah really understood what she was signing up for editing this book. And I think none of us on the team understood quite what we were signing up for. I personally thought it would be like an easy, it's a sort of easy free book, new and selected. You just cherry pick your favorite poems from previous publications and then tack on a few new ones and new book. But it was actually quite a wrenching experience to try to figure out which were the ones to choose. Over sort of a lifetime where there were so many different subjects that I wrote about and so many different experiences I had over the years. It was a very long trajectory, and Sarah sort of made it easier and also worse because she asked ties to my her grandfather grew up in my village. It's a little village, Mennonite village called Rhineland, and he was the high school principal of the high school I went to. And so she comes from that same heritage, and she understood the depth and the long miles of getting from a very, very traditionalist upbringing on the prairies to here, wherever this is here now. And so as a result, I ended up, it was this kind of, it ended up being a kind of life review for me, I'm taking the poems out of their original context and putting them in a new context and thinking, what do they mean now? And it was sort of like, it was quite a wrenching experience. And I felt like, oh, what have I done? What did I do? And what does it all add up to now? And so it was good for me, I think, to go through such a life review. And my life isn't over now. I get to go and do other things. So, so thank you, Sarah, ever so much, and James and Sharon and Melissa for staying with me through that whole much longer and deeper process than what we had anticipated, I think. And since you were talking about the questions, I asked my mother, I just changed my reading list here, and I'm going to read that piece for you in the basement. And Waldy, that was really nice of you to give your daughter this book. It's sort of a touching story for me to know that you entrusted your beautiful daughter with the sort of volatile questions of the questions I asked my mother. So this is questions I asked my mother. Look, when Grandpa died last week, everybody said he's better off where he is because he's in heaven now. He's with God. We should be happy he's gone home. But yesterday, when they put him in the ground, the minister said he's going to be there till the last trumpet raises, the quick and the dead for the final judgment. Now, look, Mom, I can't figure out which is true. It's got to be either up or down. I mean, what's he going to do? Swoop back into his body at the last moment so he can rise with the trumpet call or what? I got to know, Mom. What do you think? My mother is sewing. She's incredibly nimble with her fingers. My father marvels at them. She's sewed all our clothes since we were born, embroidered, designed them. She bites the thread carefully before answering. Now, Diana, she says, and then stops. I can see my question is too much for her. Dad, she calls into the other room. Come here a minute and listen to what this girl is asking. I have to repeat the whole thing, my voice rising desperately. Will. When Grandpa died last week, everybody said he's better off where he is because he's in heaven now. He's with God. But yesterday when they put him in the ground, the minister said he's going to be there till the last trumpet raises the quick and the dead for the final judgment. And I can't figure out which is true. He's got to be either up or down. What's he going to do? Swoop back into his body at the last moment so he can rise with the trumpet call or what? They look at each other, complicity in their eyes. I don't think that's a very nice thing to say about Grandpa, she begins. She wouldn't say this if we were alone. It's an introduction. She lets him finish with the big stuff. It's your attitude, he says. I've noticed lately everything you say has this questioning tone. I don't think you're really interested in Grandpa or your faith. What you really want is to make trouble for Mom and me. You've always been like that. You're always trying to figure everything out your own way instead of submitting quietly to the teachings of the church. When are you going to learn not everything in the world has to make sense? Your brain is not the most important thing in the world. What counts is your attitude and your faith, your willingness to accept the mystery of God's ways. Another time I asked her, Mom, I've been thinking about arithmetic, and what I'm wondering is, do you think arithmetic was invented or discovered? I mean, it seems like it must have been invented because all these signs, numbers and things, they didn't find those lying on a rock somewhere. People must have made them up, but on the other hand, it really works. I mean, do you think anybody could have invented 10 times 10 is 100? And if so, who could it have been? Well, I just don't know, she says wonderingly. I've never really thought about it. You sure come up with the strangest questions. Really, I don't know how you got to be so smart. Sometimes I just felt I would burst with all the unanswered questions inside me. I thought of writing the country guide question and answer column, but I didn't have stationery. And anyway, no one ever asked questions like that. I imagined heaven as a huge schoolroom where all the questions of the universe were answered once and for all. God was the cosmic school inspector pointing eternally to a chalkboard as big as the sky. Just imagine, I thought, Abraham and Isaac and all those guys, they already know everything. They knew about relativity centuries before Einstein, instantly like that. They don't ever have to think. One time I asked her about bread. I loved smelling the brown yeast in the huge blue speckled bowl, its sweetish ferment, watching it bubble and churn. How does it turn into bread? I asked her, well, the yeast is what makes it rise, she said. When you add warm water, it grows, as you can see, yes, but how does it turn into bread? I mean, it comes out a completely different thing. What exactly happens to it in there in the oven? Why does heat turn it into something full of holes we can eat? She sighed. My mother sighed a lot when I was around. You're asking me something I can't tell you, she said. Now help me punch down the dough. I sat in front of the oven all afternoon, bathed in warm kitchen smells, trying to figure it out. Someday, I said to myself, someday I will find out everything. I still don't know the answers to those three questions. So if anybody knows them, could you come and tell them to me afterwards? Actually, later, after this book was published, and I could start thinking about everything in a different way, having given these stories, shared them with other people, I realized that those three questions, they also sort of correspond with this sort of, I grew up in three languages. One was Mennonite traditional peasant languages, poetic, And then we had German, which was our church language, and then we had English in school and, you know, going to town to go shopping or something. And those three languages, and we were not allowed to mix them up ever. You were not allowed to ever speak the wrong one in the wrong place. You could get a strapping or a beating or something if you did that. So we were always trying so hard, but the children, of course, we did mix them up and make our own little patois jokes and stuff. But, you know, and later I realized that those were not only three different languages, they were three completely different paradigms, cultural paradigms, different cultural personalities. We were different people when we were in the different languages, and they were all really contradictory to each other. And I guess one of the projects of that first book and of all my writing has been to try to weave together all the different discourses. I think everybody has many different discourses now, but we had them in a very heightened way. And yeah, trying to figure out what do they have to do with each other. Sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the answer is, oh yeah, actually that's sort of the same thing, but just saying it, it's thinking about it in a different way. Okay. My mother found herself one late summer afternoon lying in grass under the wild yellow plum tree, jeweled with sunlight. She was forgotten there in spring, picking rhubarb for pie, and the children home from school hungry, and her new dress half-hemmed for Sunday. The wind and rain made her skin ruddy like a peach. Her hair was covered with wet fallen crabapple blossoms. She didn't know what to do with her, so she put her up in the pantry among glass jars of jellied fruit. She might have stayed there all winter, except we were playing robbers, and the pantry was jail, and every caught thief of us heard her soft moan. She made her escape while we argued over who broke the pickled watermelon jar, scattering cubes of pale pink flesh and vinegar over the basement floor. My mother didn't mind. She handed us mop and broom smiling and went back upstairs. I think she was listening to herself in the wind, singing. So yeah, I guess we had a fourth, so there was a fourth, not language, but paradigm that I grew up with, which was the wide open prairie that I spent my childhood on, looking out at, you know, where are we? Where is here, as Mother Fry famously said, where is here? Where are we? And what was here before we were here? Because we haven't been here very long. And trying to figure out, and you know, sort of none of the stories we told at that time and that we were being told in school had anything to do with the prairie, really. So that was one of the reasons I had to become a writer, I guess, is to figure out where I was, where I am, and what do all those languages and words have to do with each other. This is called Teaching in Prison. So I've been teaching in many different contexts and many university contexts for many years, several decades. One of the first places I was ever sent from the University of Winnipeg was to go and teach a couple of courses at Stony Mountain Institute, maximum security men's prison. And I was teaching them how to write essays, you know, compare and contrast and stuff like that. And it was so interesting. And the whole time I was there, I thought, yeah, they wrote interesting essays like comparing the Peruvian prison system with the Canadian one. This one person said the Peruvian one is much superior because you can keep your women and you can keep your business going, you know. Here they take it all away. Where's the incentive? Why are you supposed to start over again when you get out? So the whole time I was there, I thought, I'm not exactly sure what I'm teaching them, but I sure know what I'm learning. You teach me the dignity of desperate men, how to live with my ear to the ground, hands open and bent or curled around nothing, like baby's fists. Behind your two old eyes, I see your still kept innocence, your young boy's love. The way you look at each other and at me, imagining another place, your bones knowing already the cold old call of the boneyard, the dark sweet smell of Mother Earth. The way you listen to words not for the meaning, but for the sound of them, deep in the throat. The way you remember behind these walls hunger and cold and sweetgrass and wood smoke, the flick of a knife in winter, the walls of your grandmother's house. The poem no one will ever see. The poem made out of darkness. So dark it swallows up the light, the white page, the eye seeing, the eye seeing. Energy turned inside out, collapsing into itself, a swirling vortex, the black hole. Danger. I want to be the first astronaut to go into the black hole, she said. But I wouldn't want you to do that, I said. If you go into the black hole, you can't come back out. Well, then she said, I'm going to be the first astronaut to go into the black hole and come back out again, alive. The black hole, turning, swirling, dangerous, the poem no one will ever see, breaking, scattering, leaking onto the page, the eye seeing time flowing backwards, the trees' leaves lifting themselves from the damp grass onto green stems, sap running back to the ground, every black branch pulling itself back into seedlings, young, tender, the dark turning itself inside out, bowing elegantly toward the light. This is called interspecies communication. It's for Agatha Dick and the bees. So many of you know Agatha Dick, a very famous artist in Winnipeg, and she's been collaborating with bees for honeybees for many years. And one year she extended the collaboration to include poetry. And she asked me to write a poem for her bees. And I took it totally literally. She was going to give it to the bees, and then they would reply with the honeycomb. I said, I took it very literally. I'm going to write a poem for the bees, and then they will actually read it. And then I got really scared, and I thought, well, I tried to shrink myself down to bee size, to be able to talk to them. And then I got really scared, and I thought, what could I possibly want to have to say as a human being from this, very destructive species that we've become on the earth and is hurting their environment and ours, that they would possibly want to hear. So I thought I must write something really apologetic and abject. And I spent the summer, trying to hang out with it. This was at the St. Norbert Arts Center. That's where her bees were, and that's where I was staying for the summer. So I spent the summer, hanging out with her bees and trying to see the world from the bee point of view, and see what the neighborhood was, like how big their neighborhood was, and eating this delicious honey from their hives. And then eventually I was ready to write the poem. It didn't come out at all the way I had been planning for it to come out. I felt inhabited by the bees. And then everything goes bee, sun exploding into green, the mad skydive through shards of diamond light, earth veering left, then right, then left, sweet scented, the honing in, the buzz, the yes-no dance, the quantum leap into open swoon of calendula, yellow, orange, delphinium, starflower, ultraviolet milkweed, forget-me-not, caress of corolla, carpal calyx, sharp tongue flick into nectar, delicious rub of belly against silk, shudder of pollen-heavy thighs, the long, slow sip of honey mead, sigh of sated petals in the wind, the drunken stagger, hiveward, confused weave through chlorpyrifus, malathion, ribboned corridors of poisoned insectless late afternoon air, drumbee, dumbledore, hummabee, the familiar brush swarm crawl of bee on bee on bee on bee, sentries, warriors, scouts, promiscuous, architects, sculptors, whimsical, perfectionists, singers, nurses, studs, this honeyed home, tech mid-huerta, this droning harem, this feminine monarchy, the mother deep in her dark cell, quivering, licked and adored, oh mother bride, oh queen of earth and sky, oh goddess. At the end of this dark century of human destruction and despair, as always, of joyful, delirious, magic flowered honey love. That's what I learned from the bees is, how should you respond to an endangered environment? Make more honey. 1 minute, you were skimming lightly through air. The next, you were twisted around your bicycle, your bones learning the new quantum geometry of angles without light, only sound. whirling through dense space to find your way back to this gravitas, this ground. Always, you are the child of lightning, dancing quickly between clouds. Here in your new arms, between sutured elbow and wrist, sings the knowledge of pavement, of blood that is lust for earth dust, calling us down. My friend Sherry, who lives in Montreal, sent me an email and she said she'd had this bicycle accident. So I wrote that poem for her and I sent it to her. And she wrote me back and she said it wasn't like that at all. And here's a poem I wrote for my friend Alexis. That time you were dead and made of clay, and saw from the ceiling the seam of your cracked heart, unevenly stitched and glowing in the dark. And your friend raised you back into this same life, this world with its jackhammer love tearing it apart. And you understood a continent is not big enough for the enemies in your blood. And one half followed your father, truant, truculent across the Tamarack Sea, and the other stayed. The moon played on her black hair under the quivering hibiscus at night, and you too green to be her man. These are mothers, their sighs, their salty washed eyes, long hands hearkening after us on the gravel path through the trees, their lost hope on our lips, and we vaulting through clouds, seeking our futures fugitively. Now with that poem, I had the opposite experience, which was I gave this poem to my friend Alexis, who is from Chile, and he had been telling me about the difficult experience of emigrating to Canada and feeling torn between these two countries. And I read him the poem and he said, "How did you know?" And I said, "How did I know what?" And he said, "How did you know about my cracked heart?" And I said, "Well, you told me you were like torn between these different lives and different homes." And he said, "No, I had a heart attack and I had to have this open heart surgery, and they stitched my heart together unevenly. How did you know that?" I was like, I've actually had that experience often. Those of you who are poets in the room, you'll actually know that experience too. There's something magical about poetry. Sometimes some of it comes from somewhere. You don't exactly know where it comes from, and sometimes you pull in magic, and sometimes you pull in stuff you didn't know. Here's another poem about accidents. Accidents, all accidents. As the elephant says in the kid's story, who is asked to apologize for trampling on the toys left out in the yard, and does so most eloquently and gracefully, gathering in his own clumsiness and the kids' forgetfulness and leaving them out there. And of course, the moms and dads' tired distractedness, putting the energetic children to bed. I see now, Daddy. It was like the elephant said, accidents, all accidents. And perhaps everything can, after all, be replaced or fixed. Do you think that's true? I've had some readers get really mad at me for saying that, for thinking that. I said, no, it cannot. How dare you say such a thing?
Can you give the page number
For that one?
for each one?
For each one, no, I'm not going to. You can read them afterwards.
Okay, fair enough.
Walking to Mohakar. There's more than one Mohakar in the world, but the Mohakar that I visited is a little town in the south of Andalusia in Spain, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, where I was lucky to spend a month in an artist retreat. It was a really wonderful experience. It's a little tiny little old city that's on a hill overlooking the sea. Lorca country. Not hard to write poetry there. It's like Lorca lying on the fields. You just inhale it up and write it down. Along the winding car-studded new highways of the still rosemary-scented Andalusian hills, the poets wander, bewildered, out of time, flayed by the centuries' losses weighing heavy on them. Herds of invisible sky sheep driven by wind. On the lip of a ragged colina overlooking the sea, bright red canciones spring from jutted rock, not for a moment. Federico Garcia Lorca, not for a moment, dark-eyed leopard, lovely lover, are you alone, who charmed the serpents of the Hudson River into camellia starred weaving, who wept loud and long over the crucified bones of the world's tortured boy men, racked on gray steel-girded street corners, scattered shivering on brown bombshell beaches. You gave us blue fireflies over New York. You saw the sky flee before the black plumes of smoke and tumult of windows. You insisted on dancing among columns of blood. Half the world is sand, you said, the other half mercury. You were lightning flashing in between. We taste ashes in our mouths, Federico. The tourists have pissed in the wells. The olive trees are drying up. Fly back to us across the implacable Atlantic. Bring along your dark doves, masks, roses, little eagles. So a few years ago, I was living in Brandon and was teaching at Brandon University, and we had a lot of visiting Chinese professors there. We had an exchange program with the Chinese university. And one of them gave me a copy of the recent translation of the Tao Te Ching, which is the ancient sacred text of the Taoist religion and tradition. And I was reading the translation, and the Tao is, you know, the great nothing in everything, that everything comes from. But the translator was translating the Tao as it. And I thought it is so the wrong pronoun in English for the Tao, because it refers to the thing, the thing. So I thought I'm going to just fool around with these translations a little bit, and just sort of retranslate them and sort of like in the way that I would understand them here and now in Canada, sort of translate them, bring them over here. And so I thought, what other pronouns are there? So I thought, well, I'm just going to try she. And so I put in lots of she's, and it just opened that text for me in this, again, sort of magical way. And that was a very deep experience for me. I wanted to be really reverent, and I wanted to be, you know, really honoring as a visitor to another tradition. Well, I wanted to be honoring of one's own tradition as well, but I did not have any quarrels with that one. So I wanted it to be homage. And I found, you know, the Taoist tradition is it's a very visionary tradition, and everybody that translates the Tao Te Ching works with the Tao Te Ching has all kinds of visions, and that happened to me too. So it's a really powerful tradition. And so I'm going to read you two poems from this, from my translations of the Tao Te Ching. And they were sort of, I don't know, yeah, sort of life-changing for me. Actually, every book I wrote was life-changing for me. I've lived a long time and gone through many changes. This is Stalwart Protectors of the Deep. Most living beings have not forgotten the generosity and power of the grandmother. They honor their relations with one another. They keep their part in preserving the great harmony. The deep blue sky remains translucent and calm. The round blue-green earth holds her precise place and motion intact in the turning galaxy. Oak trees and cherry blossoms, foxes and cows and songbirds and humans each preserve their form. The mothers and sometimes fathers and others take tender care of the young. The great oceans remain stalwart protectors of the deep. Presidents and prime ministers and queens direct their people to get along and practice reciprocity in their negotiations and transactions. The world over, people sing and dance and tell stories. None of this could happen without the sweet, harmonious oversight of the great mother, in whose humming, cradling, spinning, singing embrace we are held. For without translucence, the sky would rip and shred. Without precision and steadiness, the earth would wobble and spin out of control. Without the stalwart protection of the oceans, the deep would get clogged and dry up. Without the care and kindness of all living species toward their young, life on Earth would cease. Without considerable wisdom and honor in their government of the people, prime ministers and queens would immediately be overthrown. All the sympathetic resonances of earth and heaven are part of the great harmony. Let's proceed with humility, remembering our small part in preserving the shimmering, vibrating, live, breathing network of the great whole. You see how contrary that is to the way we are sort of encouraged to think about the world every day as full of trouble, and everything is full of trouble, nothing's working properly. So I found it very inspiring to think about life in this really grand dimension, and all the ways it is so beautiful and perfect, even though there's also lots of troubles we have to deal with. And this is Spindly Burled Trunks. This was one of Sarah's favorite poems. She's like, you can't put this book together without you can't leave out Spindly Burled Trunks. She sits in her little room looking out onto sparkling snow. The fire crackles in the stove. The smoldering wood seethes and hisses, dropping sparks into the ash below. She cries out for consolation to the bright moon shining through the window in the deepening silence, the bustling world receding from her view. She looks inward and sees black quartz glinting in her breast. Sitting alone like this, curled around her sorrow, letting herself become gnarled and twisted, like the stunted maple trees along the Red River, with their spindly burled trunks, acquired in rough weather, tracing her way carefully back through her suffering to golden stillness. This is how she becomes whole. And I'll end with this poem called River People, dedicated to Thompson Raymond, that's Thompson Highway, and his partner Raymond Lalonde. So I wrote this for the city of Winnipeg when I was the inaugural poet laureate. It was such a great honor to be the first poet laureate and to have this assignment of writing poems about this city for this city. And because I came to this city as a young woman from a very, very completely different culture, and walked around in a daze for like a decade trying to figure out how, oh, so this is what a modern city is. Okay, this is what city people do. And, oh, you're not allowed to do that. Oh, I see. Okay, you're supposed to do this. And well, this is how this works. It was really so wonderful to be invited to be speaking about a for and to Winnipeg. So this is River People. I have come now to live with the river people. I was raised among the earth people, proud dirt under the fingernails, long, rugged, silent days of hoeing and plowing, electric barbed wire to keep the cows in, tin granaries bulging with ripe wheat, bright orange carrots rooted improbably, juicy, green feather-topped in cracked black soil, meadowlarks perched on the fence posts along the gravel road, announcing the morning with their cheery trilling song. I lived with the lake people for a while. Sand-colored beaches, blue-gray water, sparkling sky, no fixed borders anywhere, ground squirrels darting through the bushes, the slow put, put, put of the weather-beaten gray aluminum boat, pungent smell of rotted fish, rustle of dead mayflies, flash of white wings and sharp beaks, shots ringing out. Midnight feast for the whole clan, too much drink, aurora borealis painting the night sky, and the moon. There were the years I lived with asphalt and cement people, dedicated to glass and steel and cars and muddy and speed. Pinstriped linen suits over crisp white cuffs, tooled leather briefcases, color-coded digital presentations, and fashionable PowerPoint. Statistics, analyses, tables, maps, reports, hurry, hurry, faster, faster, more, more. Belgian raspberry cider in gold-rimmed glasses, yachts and sailboats on the canal, parched ditches, car accidents, the singing stars, muffled behind inky clouds. There were the years I lived in the air. Crowded cabins with TV screens built into the seatbacks, dinners on plastic trays, smiling servants everywhere, lipstick, pantyhose, eyeshadow, stilettos, yellow turbans and hand-embroidered slippers, passports, hotel reservations, wait lines, security checks. Fresh squeezed orange juice for breakfast, crisp papaya salad for lunch, pina colada at 7, ambassadorial receptions, keynote addresses, interviews, pictures in the newspapers. I have come now to live with the river people. We sit on the reedy shore and watch the water flow by, urgently, purposefully, carrying the continent's pulse and debris firmly along to the bay we have heard about on the edge of a mythical northern ocean with seal mermaids and melting ice floes far away. We watch the people living on the other side with their bigger yards and lusher gardens and louder dinner parties, knowing we live on the superior, wilder, slower, freer side, don't we? And do they feel pity or envy looking across at us perched on our unadorned rocks with our fishing lines and ragged sprawling nettle and burdock groves? We chat with the geese. We watch the sun's reflection as it's going down, a long wavering red line slashing the water. We sing to the fish. We scatter many-colored flower petals to the spirit bones, our beloved, remembered, drowned, the overdosed, the lost, the disappeared. The deep heart's cry of why? We pick wild berries, sumac, raspberry, blackberry on the shore. The smoke of our tiny backyard fires, tobacco lit, spirals upward toward the heavens. My fingers begin to remember how to weave willow baskets and bright colored shawls. My lips begin to mutter the old songs in the old languages, my tongue curling gingerly around the strange and familiar sounds. I begin to hear the babble and gurgle, the glug, glug, glug at the earth's deep core. My mind begins to wander the swirling galaxies. What could I possibly want more?
Okay, thank you so much for that reading, Di. That was beautiful.
Well, and thank you again for being such a great editor and such a great companion in this hard work of putting this book together.
It's a pleasure to spend time with these poems. I want to start by asking about the book's title, The Sweetest Dance on Earth. We are living in a deeply anxious time, and a lot of contemporary poetry foregrounds that anxiety. Can you talk about the poetics of sweetness and dancing in your collection, given our present context?
See how lovely she is. She just goes straight for the heart of the thing. Yeah, the poetics of sweetness, hard-earned in some ways. In my case, I guess. In some ways, I think I'm going back to a traditional, very old traditional understanding of poetry as a thing of beauty, as a practice of beauty, celebrating beauty and trying to create beauty and trying to say beautiful things to each other. The ancient Aztecs had an annual poetry competition, which they called the Battle of the Flowers. And then the aim was to see who could move people's hearts the most, or open their hearts and sort of tenderize them the most. So yeah, in some ways I think I've gone back to that, but I don't think it's been like, in some ways I would say it's a reparative and not quite remorseful is not quite the right word, but it's sort of transformative gesture on my part. I did get swept into the 20th century, sort of habit of complaint, irony and complaint, which is fun to do, go around complaining about everything. and everyone. There's also, Margaret Lawrence in her wonderful novel, The Diviners, she gave us that wonderful character, Royland, old man of the river. He was a hellfire and brimstone preacher, and he went around and, telling everybody to repent, repent, the end of the world is at hand. And he was very harsh on people, and he drove his wife she eventually committed suicide, and this was a very startling event for him, and he kind of woke up to a different, to understanding the world in a different way, and he thought maybe instead of trying to bring fire on people's heads, I could become a diviner and learn how to divine water and find out where is the sweet water under the earth and help people find it and bring them something nourishing instead. So I think anybody who grew up with Christianity, and at least in the church, preachy kind of churchy way, remembers some of that judgmental sort of part of that heritage, and it's certainly part of my heritage, and I have that temptation in me, and so I think I've worked really hard at trying to become more like a diviner than a preacher, and so it's about that, I think, and but it's also, my epigraph is from Mara Haas, who was a wonderful Winnipeg poet, and who had a big influence on my becoming a poet, and she published this book called Why Isn't Everybody Dancing? And I've been going around asking people, what do you think is the sweetest dance on earth? And everybody has an answer for it, and they're so diverse, the answers, and people don't think long, they just say right away what they think it is. So there's a lot of sweet dancing going on around. It's not a minority thing. It's like maybe the main thing. So something to really celebrate. So that's what I guess I'm trying to do in the Poetics of Sweetness. But we had trouble coming up with like a cover image and like a font and stuff that would like it's a grand claim, the sweetest in the world, so it is in some ways contrary to the sort of the prevailing postmodern aesthetic, trying to come up with something sweet. And what I was thinking of was the kind of the embroidery practices of the women in my village, embroidering beautiful flowers on the pillowcases, so we have beautiful pillowcases to sleep on and so on. So trying to recuperate some of that part of my inheritance as well.
I love thinking about the act of being a poet as similar to divining, and as this book is sweet water. It's really beautiful. I'm going to go to since you brought it up, the religion question that I have here. Religion is a consistent theme throughout your books. In the poem, which you read, the speaker says, questions I asked my mother, the speaker says, sometimes I just felt I would burst with all the unanswered questions inside me, and imagines heaven as a huge schoolroom where all the questions of the universe were answered once and for all, with God as the cosmic school inspector pointing eternally to a chalkboard as big as the sky. And then in Glitter and Fall, your most recent collection, God, or the Great Mother, is like a fisherwoman who quietly waits in her little boat near Gimli at the edge of Lake Winnipeg at sundown, saying and doing nothing. And heaven is described as her fishing nets, wide and strong, nothing ever escapes them. So I'm just fascinated by the way the images and understandings of God in your work has changed over the years, from a child's yearning to understand the world better, struggling with a metaphysics that includes hierarchy and punishment, to a calmer, gentler, more embodied sense of fulfillment and care. So can you talk about that trajectory? It's a big question too.
Well, you summarized that beautifully, so yes. Yeah, with that, as I already said, and with the segue in between there of trying to, become a modern secular person, which was also lots of fun, and learning how to sort of travel around the world after when I first arrived in Winnipeg, I was like in my village, we never went anywhere and we never talked to strangers. So like, it took me ever so long to figure out how to find just simple things like how to find my way downtown and back to where I came from, things like that. Like just navigating has always been a bit of trouble for me. It's still a bit of trouble for me. And then learning. And then when I first became published, like one of the reasons I became a writer is because I didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to talk to anybody. And people didn't tell me that eventually, if I did it long enough, that I would have to go everywhere and talk to everybody. So, so then I found myself for some years flying around the world, and it was such a very interesting, really, really interesting experience, getting to meet the most beautiful people everywhere I went. Poetry, it's like the best calling card, really. And that was all very inspiring, and I think like the modern world has been, for people who have a little bit of means, has been an extraordinary experience of travel and knowledge, so much knowledge about everywhere and everything. But eventually I got to, this was before the pandemic. I had this idea, this understanding before the pandemic, which was, there's such a thing as too much of a good thing, and I've scattered myself all over the world. I don't know where I am anymore. I don't know where I am, and I don't know who I am. And my friends are all so lovely, but they're so far away. And if I get sick, like they're not here, they can't bring me soup. And so I decided that I wanted to really downsize and stay in one place. So I came back to Winnipeg and stay in one place and just stayed and just get rooted in. And then with the pandemic, everybody got to do that. And for writers, of course, the isolation is not as hard as for some other people, because we spend a lot of time being asocial already at home and just thinking and hanging out in our heads. So, but there was a really extraordinary experience for me, and so starting to feel more at home, and then having this experience of getting to trans-inhalate the Tao Te Ching. And then also I'm living in the North End of Winnipeg, and I have a lot of Indigenous neighbors and friends, and so I really learned a lot about spirituality from hanging out with Indigenous people as well, and understanding that spirituality and reverence, it doesn't have to be about trying to take us turn us away from this world. It can be about embracing the world, and about respecting the world, and about gratitude for the miracle of life, of getting to be here. How astonishing. So yeah, that was the trajectory, I think. But I mean, I think it was good to have that really religious upbringing. I had a friend who once said to me, I really envy you, your religious upbringing. I said, well, it's been somewhat of a problem for me as well, because it had certain parts of it that were really difficult when I was growing up. I had become a little too controlling, too patriarchal, too trying to hold on to things that were not, that was impossible to hold on to in a time of change. So that was all really hard for me to navigate. And she said, yeah, but at least you have that space inside you. At least you know, at least you understand the gestures of reverence. And you can, put in different content maybe, but at least you already had that, which I thought was interesting.
So it looks like we maybe have time for a few audience questions. If that seems like now's the time. We'll wait for John to emerge. There he is.
I have emerged. And just as a reminder, oh, there we go. Here's a question.
Yeah, coming from one culture and then entering into another, like, it's a sort of a pilgrimage escape, the need to move away into something else. Did that enhance your powers of observation?
Yes, I would say so, yeah. Also, growing up in more than one language, you have to listen really hard, and and with all these rules, and you have to listen really hard. And then if you go, you go to another culture and you have to try to figure out, you have to just really pay attention all the time to just like, okay, so that's how they think about stuff here. You don't want to be constantly offending people or being an idiot and stuff. So yeah, yes, it was all an experience of great attention. Yeah.
It's sort of a James Joycean thing that the writer is an observer.
A James Joycean thing that the writer is an observer.
Yes, although James Joyce was part of that modernist moment where the artists were trying to, they said, we're like here, over here on the side of the culture. We're not like in the middle of it, or we're not the spokespeople of it. We're over here observing it and doing, the avant-garde and stuff. And I mean, that was a very interesting aesthetics that took us through the 20th century. But I think eventually that logic sort of ran out, because if the artists are over there and they're sort of mocking the culture that is supposed to pay for their books and their art supplies, eventually people get pissed off. And but also eventually, you don't want to be on the side. I don't want to be on the side. I mean, that's why I was so thrilled to be the poet laureate of Winnipeg. I like being like at the center of it and getting to speak from inside the experience and not from the side of it. So yeah, that's what was really meaningful for me about it.
And are there any other questions at all?
I like the question. I'm sorry that you didn't. Okay, can you ask me the question about it?
You can ask 2 more questions.
I'm allowed, yes.
Absolutely.
What about the weaving together?
Oh, sure.
I like that one. I spent a lot of time preparing to answer that question, so I'm able to answer it now.
I see behind the scenes we've had an email exchange prior to this moment. Okay, here it is. Many of your poems insist on multiple worlds at once. Your poems set in medieval Spain, from walking to Oaxaca, for example, conjure Mennonite history, buffalo herds, conflict in Syria, and quotes by William Blake. How do you weave these worlds together?
Yeah, I love that question, and I tried to sort of, I mean, I've already talked about in terms of like existential experience, but I tried to think of it for you in terms of like poetic technique. And I thought I did it differently in different books. So in my early books, I was doing it with this, I discovered, I just sort of stumbled upon this run-on line with no punctuation. And people were always saying to me, your sentences are too long. My professors, they always put in the margins of my essays, your sentences are too long. One of my professors put, they're brilliant, your sentences are brilliant, but they kill us. Could you please make them shorter? It's that old Germanic thing, right? In German, you're allowed to have a sentence that's like 2 pages long, and the subject is at the beginning, the verb is at the end, and everything else is in between. So you just hold your breath all the way through it. So I know how to do that. I grew up like that. Anyway, I found out this run-on line without the punctuation. It just sort of chased away the professor in the margin, and it just allowed me to sort of, it was like a snowball. You just roll it along, and like you could put everything in it, and so it could hold all the resonances of all my 4 paradigms all at once. The same word could have 4 different meanings. It could just, it was sort of cumulative. So that's how I did it for a while. And then after a while, that didn't feel like the right thing anymore. So then I tried the opposite, which is I tried to thin out the language and make really tiny short lines with lots of spaces in between. And every time it started running on, which is like comes naturally to me, I would, jerk the line. Okay, that's the end of that line. Okay, period, space, new thought, new sentence. Let it go, a new sentence. And so that it just thinned it all out. And I said to one of my poet friends at the time, I'm trying to write without metaphor. I'm trying to thin the language so there's no metaphor. And the person said, why on earth do you want to do that? And I said, I don't know yet, but I figured it out as I go along. And what it did was it allowed me to walk through experiences or images or understandings and then and then let them go, and then go to a different one. And so the end of the poem was often completely different than the beginning. It was like it took me somewhere else. So that was another way I did it. And then for a while I was doing it, like when I was writing Now You Care, for example, I used, you know, that modernist technique of collage and juxtaposition and disjunction, and, you know, sort of leaping across the gaps. I learned that most of all from John Thompson, wonderful, wonderful poet, if you don't know his work, and from René Char, whom John Thompson translated, the most beautiful translations of René Char, who was a French surrealist poet who left the surrealists because he thought they weren't being ethical enough and they had become too gimmicky. So he wrote this really beautiful visionary poetry, and so very inspired by them. And then the poem, like the Walking to Mohakar poem that you referred to, those were sort of, you know, those are walking poems, you know, sort of, I'm the tourist walking through this landscape, and you were talking, Brian, about the heightened sensibility. So like, you know, when you're traveling, you have that too. Like, it's like to really pay attention. Everything's new. You're like a little kid again. And your senses are open, you know, you're not filtering in the usual way. So just walking through the landscape and just trying to see everything that was there. And, you know, southern Spain was, it's very medieval there. So I felt completely at home there. I totally got it.
If you did have a final question, Sarah, you are very welcome to ask it. And after that, you folks can offer any closing comments.
One more even, special. Well, Di, do you have another one that you want me to ask? Or do I get to pick?
I can't remember what the others are now, so you're gonna have to pick.
Okay, you know what I'm gonna ask? Okay. As I reread your body of work during the editorial process of Sweetest, I was struck many times by the prescience in your poetry. Now You Care, this phenomenal work exploring eco-anxiety, came out in 2003, and the term eco-anxiety wasn't coined until 2005. Before global warming was a mainstay of everyday discourse, these poems called for people to reevaluate their relationship to the environment and to pay better attention to ecological degradation. So can you tell me about your eco-poetics?
Yes, thank you. I can. And I also want to say something about the other part of your question, which is about talking about something that nobody else has been talking about. So Peter Stevens wrote a book about Dorothy Livesay, and he said about Dorothy Livesay, she wrote about all these subjects 10 years before everybody else did. And then everybody else was doing it eventually. And I do feel I've had that experience many times myself, which is, you know, why isn't anybody writing about mothers in poetry ever? Why isn't anybody talking about the multicultural? Why isn't anybody talking about spirituality? Why isn't anybody talking about pollution and so on? Like, and sort of going out on a limb, and everybody's like, now what is she doing? What the hell? And then eventually finding out lots of other people joining in, or I don't want to take more credit than is due for like bringing new subjects into poetry, but I have often had that experience of in my corner of the world, at least, nobody's talking about this. Why aren't they talking about this? So I'm going to talk about it. And in terms of my, you know, sort of eco-poetics, such as it is, it really came out of, so I grew up here on the prairies, and then I moved at one point to Southern Ontario, where I was teaching at the University of Windsor. And so I've been through two big culture shocks in my life. The first one was going from the barefoot, I grew up barefoot. I got to go barefoot till grade 8 to school and everything. So from my barefoot village to you know, modern urban Winnipeg. When I got here, it was the height of the counterculture. So I must say, it did not disappoint. It was all the wildness that we had been warned against and more. And the second culture shock was moving to Southern Ontario, because I hadn't understood that there were such highly industrialized, highly developed places that were so urbanized and also so environmentally burdened. And it was quite the freaky experience for me. I was frightened because I'm not a terribly robust immune system, so I was like constantly worrying. And again, I found that people didn't really want to talk about it. They knew about it, but and if I tried to talk about it, they said, "Why do you have to be so negative?" But I just felt really compelled to have to figure out how to name that experience for myself. And I had to, again, change my poetics. I had to, the way I thought of it is, okay, I can't write barefoot poems on the 401 highway. I'm gonna have to put on my steel-toed boots and a hard hat, which translated for me into proper punctuation and proper language, and trying to speak in a more consciously in an adult, grown-up public voice. You know, that's not a voice that was available to me. That was like women were not allowed to speak in public in the community I grew up in ever. So like just having a voice, like a voice of some authority in a public place, that was a bit of a stretch for me. So that's what I had to learn to do, to write about the environment. Now, as far as writing about nature, I mean, that came naturally to me if you grow up barefoot. But trying to figure out how to write about it there was, and yeah, I spent a lot of time driving up and down the 401 highway. It was so frightening. And it was really a hard thing for me to learn to do it. My children were studying in Toronto and I was in Windsor, so I was driving back and forth to see them. And it was like a near-death experience every time. And I thought I was the only one. So again, I was like, I have to figure out how to write about the 401 because it's so freaky for me. And then when I wrote those poems, they were very popular in Ontario. And it turned out like all these people said, you know, we're really freaked out by the 401 as well, but we just never thought of writing poems about it before. So, yeah, it did open up, that book did open, Now You Care, that book was called, it did open up, it startled people a lot in Ontario, and opened up a whole different kind of writing there. Yeah, and maybe everywhere, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and I know you talk about when you're in the car and like you're not touching the ground at all. So to go from barefoot to hovering above the earth in a little metal car. Anyway, thank you. I think that's our time.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Oh, I'm afraid we're just actually winding down for the evening. I'm terribly sorry, but you will have ample time to interrogate Di at the signing table. So we've just come to the close of the night. So thank you so very much to Di for sharing, for reading your work. Very selfishly, I'd like to point out the endorsement of John Thompson, which is the first time he's been endorsed here. So that's geekily wonderful. Thank you very much. Also, thank you so much to Sarah for being such an incredible host this evening. Thank you for coming on board. And to all of you for your wonderful questions and your attention throughout the evening. If you are watching online, thank you for joining us tonight. The video of this launch will remain live too, so if you'd like to revisit it or share it with anybody who wasn't able to make it, please feel free to do so. We'll now move along to the signing portion of the evening, so I'll ask you all just to remain in place for one moment while we transport Di over to the signing table. That's located just beside our cash desk, so please do feel free to come over. We'll wander over and say hello to Di, get a copy of the book signed. We have copies at the central cash desk. We also have copies on the table. Feel free to get a copy of the book signed. Just please do pay for the copy at some point this evening before you get the We're so grateful to Turnstone Press again for publishing this collection, for helping to make this evening happen. Thank you all so very much for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.